Oil surfaces in the present as a mechanization of the earth of the highest order. To conceptualize fossil fuel requires envisioning the innards of the globe as a mechanical factory spewing out fuel, not unlike Henry's philosophy of petroleum in the late 1800s. Oil seeps to the surface as an aberration, the accidental leakage of an otherwise highly efficient machine across depths of time unimaginable to industrial capitalism. Hence, industrialization's imperative to access the natural efficiencies of the deep earth. The mechanical metaphor of earth devours the very existence of earth's internal depths. Making oil fuel tapped that vector of depth in previously unthinkable ways, just as refiguring oil materializes the unthinkable beyond metaphors of dimensional space or of resource commodification, in favor of media, an infrastructure of differentiation that does not have determinate qualities that pre-exist the specific conditions of its representation. Why refigure oil as media? In the simplest of terms, oil is too often understood as a binary, either an unavoidable industrial catalyst carrying the potential for great energy and wealth, or as a catastrophic environmental hazard responsible for vast ecological destruction. Conceptualizing oil as media provides new practices to understand the ongoing differentiation of oil, and because of the ubiquity of oil, life itself. Refiguring oil as elemental media, in this case, carries dual meaning. Expanding a concept of the natural elemental as media, which media theorist U.C. Parika and John Durham Peters speak to, and agential realism's illustration that the elemental, foundational parts of media are not determinate by scale, speed, voluminous topology, or limited to practices of mediation. Rather, media are defined by the elemental cuts and practices of cutting, of differentiating within an apparatus. Media are infrastructures of differentiation. Oil is a monolithic apparatus of differentiation in contemporary life. In response to early digital culture, a wave of new media theorists and artists and a swell of new interpretations of old theorists have debunked the notion that the virtual age is immaterial. The internet is a physical network, and the materials off the ground have profound consequences to local and global ecologies, and are inequitably distributed in through the bodies of laborers, users, kin, and other species beings. Increasingly, climate catastrophe and the nature-cultural entanglements of the Anthropocene are viewed as interlocking the issues of modern technology and environmental survival. Even if this does nothing to address the ontological exceptionalism that Western industrialism has produced, or other critiques of the Anthropocene, the material of the virtual matters. The digital divide is an illusion. In response to the material turn, a number of sub-disciplines within media studies have emerged as stewards of media materiality, building upon the early work of Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innis, and the German school of media theory associated with Friedrich Hitler. Thinking about oil as constructing the limits of an industrial empire, as Innis did with papyrus, clay, and other raw materials, emphasizes the space and time bias of oil. It has particular ways of transmitting through time, inscribing the earth, a colossal inscription of carbon. It transmits across the surface of the earth in various states of liquidity, from bituminous coal-like states to refined oil, scorching it, gritting it, commodifying it, standardizing it. Industrial conceptions of oil not only proposes a sort of global empire, as pipelines, tankers, and railways slither across the planet and mutually transform it in the process, but it also insists on a cosmological sense of deep time. Oil lives on as the corpse of sunlight buried deep in the earth for millions of years before it is revived in the black magic exorcism of capitalist desires in the mid-1800s. Oil is a medium of the sun. The annihilation of space and time by media technology is a frequent topic of media theory, and some have specifically taken on the cultural techniques initiated by railroad time, Shivelbush, Undersea Cable Networks, Staroslawski, A History of Urban Media, Mattern, or Code Space, Kitchen and Dodge. It is McLuhan who proposes that for the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. More than 55 years later, McLuhan still governs popular understanding of media relations, even if a contemporary public forgot who McLuhan is. McLuhan also said, quote, "Technological media are staples or natural resources exactly as are coal and cotton and oil," end quote. In the recent special issue, Oil and Media, Oil as Media, Mediating Petrocultures Then and Now, the editors of the Canadian journal Mediatropes suggest that this is the foundation for the material turn that enables reading oil as media in the present. Citing the litany of contemporary media scholars doing elemental and infrastructural work, David Barney, Keller Easterling, Sean Cubitt, Parika, and Nicole Staroslawski, they provide a heuristics to read oil and media, oil as media. Oil and as media, however, is more than just a semantic difference, and one that takes the nature-cultural entanglements of oil, the elemental analysis, seriously. The journal does not account for the most important critique of the entanglement of oil as media. McLuhan's shortcoming is the perspective that information is ontologically determinate by humans. Parika picks up on this by enlisting Robert Smithson's notion of abstract geology. Smithson, Parika argues, quote, was ready to mobilize his notion emerging in the artistic discourse of land art in the 1960s to a conceptualization of technology that we can say was nothing less than anti-McLuhanian. Instead of seeing technology as extensions of man, technology is aggregated and made of raw materials of the earth, end quote. Smithson connects to a history of art that resonates with some of the media art throughout this document. Nonetheless, it is Karen Barad's agential realism that provides more heft in rethinking the nature of matter and, importantly, the annihilation of space and time. Thinking about oil as media means thinking about the space and time, the space-time of oil, and how it matters. Where and how it moves at different scales, what it does and how it does what it does. How oil produces, quote, us, what Brett Bloom calls petrosubjectivity. What activities persist and what information is mobilized, and how the infrastructures that mobilized oil produce it as a mobilizing force. Barad's material discursive interaction moves beyond Bloom's critique of language and oil metaphors. Thinking about oil in this way recognizes that oil creates new space along the path it takes, or rather, the path it co-constitutes. Oil enacts what Peters calls, quote, conditions for existence, end quote, in ways that exceed human measurement. By limiting the consideration of oil to a resource commodity, a fossil fuel, it ignores the in-between, the journey and the metamorphosis, through, with, space, time. But not only this, it ignores the way oil standardizes and actualizes a sense of how things are. Oil persists as a material that acts onto, in the world, in ways that exceed its resource status. To be sure, the world is not a blank slate prior to oil to be acted on, nor are, quote, we. Thinking about oil as media means thinking about the way that it changes and is changed by the things it encounters, including, and particularly, the conditions that constitute its own representation, the dynamic space-time mattering of oil. However, if I am to be truthful to a post-humanist account of oil and media, indeed oil as media, then these notions of time and space need to be examined. Barad's notion of, quote, post-humanism doesn't presume the separateness of anything, let alone the alleged spatial, ontological, and epistemological distinction that sets humans apart, end quote. Conventional media, what might be described as mass media, film, radio, television, the internet, etc., are granted a certain persistence in time. The moving image, the study of cinema, from which many media studies frameworks emerge, are largely focused on the mediation of meaning through time by image or sound. McLuhan established, quote, the change of scale or pace or pattern that media or technology introduces into human affairs, end quote, as the basis for the modern study of media. The mediation of technology in society is expressed in this way. The medium is the message. The mediation depends on the medium. The message is the matter. To better understand the way that media exceeds representational notions of the human, whatever that might be, Barad's agential realism is an important theory to think with new media theories. The mediating apparatus of media studies co-produces particular practices of representation through which particular representations of mediation, time, and space are mutually enacted. Just as Carolyn Marvin and McLuhan discussed the way electricity brought about a new paradigm of media cultural awareness, agential realism introduces an onto-epistemological rupture into the infrastructures of media imagining. In the introduction to A Geology of Media, Parikka describes what he means by media materialism. Quote, media materialism refers to the necessity to analyze media technologies as something that are irreducible to what we think of them or even how we use them. It has come to refer to technology as an active agent in the ontological and epistemological sense. In other words, media structure how things are in the world and how things are known in the world, end quote. Parikka's description of media materiality opens the door to think with the agential realist conception of the apparatus and that of differentiation in media theory. On its own, the description does not work beyond an anthropomorphized sense of how things are per se. But at the core of Parikka's project is a notion of the geologic. Quote, a different sort of temporal and spatial materialism, end quote, beyond Friedrich Hitler, that embraces Peter's cosmological axis of space and time, in some ways familiar to Innes and McLuhan. These commitments secure a foundation for a media materialism that does not presume the materials of media have meaning prior to their representation through the media apparatuses they construct. It distinguishes from what others have argued are, quote, the mediating properties of ecologies themselves, Staroselski and Janet Walker, or matter as medium, Bernd Herzogenrath. In a blog post in 2009, Parikka briefly took up the idea of a, quote, new apparatus theory of media through agential realism. Quote, in this context, Barad produces this 6-part summary of what apparatuses are, especially in the context of physical measurements and laboratory work, but something I would suggest you to read as media theory as well. In other words, replace in the text below, quoting from Barad, Meeting the Universe Halfway, page 146, every word apparatus with media. I find it a very good and material dynamic way to understand the ontology of media technologies. 1. Apparatuses are specific material discursive practices. They are not merely laboratory setups that embody human concepts and take measurements. 2. Apparatuses produce differences that matter. They are boundary-making practices that are formative of matter and meaning, productive of and part of the phenomena produced. 3. Apparatuses are material configurations, dynamic reconfigurings of the world. 4. Apparatuses are themselves phenomena, constituted and dynamically reconstituted as part of the ongoing interactivity of the world. 5. Apparatuses have no intrinsic boundaries, but are open-ended practices. And 6, apparatuses are not located in the world, but are material configurations and reconfigurings of the world that reconfigure spatiality and temporality, as well as the traditional notion of dynamics, i.e., they do not exist as static structures, nor do they merely unfold or evolve in space and time." End quote. It is unsurprising that Parikka took up such an endeavor. A geology of media builds upon the not quite media-archaeological approach to media materiality attributed to Kittler. This tradition of media theory embraced a pseudo-posthumanist perspective that granted agency to the materials of media production, which are implicated in the production of what Kittler called the so-called man. Parikka's attention to what he calls media natures in the materialization of digital culture links together the nature-cultural work of feminist science studies philosophers, including Donna Haraway and Barad. The blog post is a convenient and concise summary, but it leaves out what I think is a key explanation of the apparatus. Quote, "The material conditions of possibility and impossibility of mattering. They enact what matters and what is excluded from mattering." End quote. The apparatus indeed shares resemblance to Parikka's media materialism. In addition to Parikka's suggestion that apparatuses be replaced with media, the material dynamic nature of agential realism encourages replacing mediation with differentiation. Mediation, which implies predetermined categories of what mediates and what has agency to be mediated, originates from a specific inheritance of humanist values in contemporary thought. Even as the boundaries of media theory continue to be stretched, mediation remains a central concept. In fact, Stephanie Lemanger has written about the mediating effects of oil on culture. Quote, "The objects derived from petroleum that mediate our relationship as humans, to other life, and to things. We experience ourselves as moderns, and most especially as modern Americans, every day in oil, living within oil, breathing it, and registering it with our senses." End quote. Media and cultural theorists have taken up oil as a subject of great importance. An entire subdiscipline of the energy humanities, petrocultures, established by Imre Simon, is a burgeoning field. But they do not devote consideration to the role of mediation in creating essentialized anthropocentric space and time, subject-object relations. Parikka is not the only media theorist to take up agential realism. In Molecular Red, Theory for the Anthropocene, media theorist Mackenzie Wark explores it as a potential techtology, a unifying technosocial theory. Wark says, quote, "Particularly troubling for such realisms are mediating phenomena. Something has to go on at the boundary between the object world and subjective cognition." End quote. Wark is one of just a few theorists attentive to the productive potential of an agential realist media theory. But they too do not escape the essentialism of mediation that relies on a prior given notion of object and subject. Quote, "An alternative starting point," Wark suggests, "might be to take the mediation, the stuff between the object and subject, to be what at first glance or grasp is most real." End quote. It is an interesting proposition. The real is always already the metamorphosis itself. Isn't this the classic definition of media? In media res, and in between? The real is media. But, as agential realism shows, there is no prior real. And even as the move constructs fluid subject-object conditions, the reliance on ontologically determinate subjects and objects fails to materialize the dynamic nature of differentiation. Mediation requires that subjects and objects have inherent characteristics, including determinate spatial and temporal attributes, that exist prior to the conditions that are mediated. interaction shows that no such relations exist.